Well, let me simply mention one thing. I don't know whether you're worried about it or not. It's assignments. As you know, you're required to come up with the first paper by the 25th of this month. And the first paper, actually, Thursday, will give you some instructions, but it's not important. The first paper is basically your reflection, your personal reflection to the analytes, and of course based upon the lectures and the discussion. And when I use the word personal, I make it very clear distinction between personal and private. If it's private, normally you don't share with most people, and it's subjective. And personal meaning that you feel strongly that you want to share. It's public accountable. It's discussable. Also falsifiable. So when you say personal, I mean that your relationship to the analytes is not simply to read about it, but to read from it. In other words, almost like your engagement with the analytes and come up with a reflection. It's personal, but you are writing it not for yourself, but for the class and maybe for the universe, for the public. So this is the sense of being personal. We give you some suggestions, but we just go ahead. I think the next paper will be more textual based. We give you a few texts, and you may choose a text to analyze. Okay. It's relatively simple. I think we ask you to write 3 papers, and then we go to the final exam. I think the 3 papers will constitute 20% each. And then the final exam is much smaller. Then I think the TF will have discretionary. You know, the final exam is 40%, but the TF will
30%.
30%. The TA has discretionary power. So if you get a B or B plus, and he thinks that you're doing well, he can raise you to A minus. And if you do A minus, you do very poorly, you can say you deserve B plus. Okay, so some discretionary power. So I urge you to take part in the discussion session as well. So for these 2 sessions, we're focusing on the analytes. And I just assume you've already gone through the analytes at least once. And you should have your analytes with you. And the first question I want to address, I think may be helpful, is what kind of text we're talking about. You know, your first impression, maybe like Hegel's impression, that analytes consists of a number of aphorisms, number of statements. And these statements do not cohere into a holistic conception. So Hegel thinks it's not philosophical, at least philosophically sophisticated. So it's something that, the moral reasoning become moralizing. These instructions, you just read it, the master says, and there's no question. And you become a recipient. You're very, more or less, very passive. So that's not good enough. And then Purple Fingeret, this is the book, it's on the web, so you should be able to read it. It's a beautiful book, only about 80 pages. It's called Confucius, the Secular Essay Book. And it's one of the most thought-provoking books in Confucian studies in the last almost 30 or 40 years. And as a philosopher, American philosopher, who was never trained as a sinologist, meaning someone who was involved in Chinese studies, so didn't know a word of Chinese when we began. I don't know whether I mentioned it this class or not. I'm involved in so many classes on Confucianism, sometimes got confused. But anyway, he, in order to understand the analytes, he studied Chinese. He recognized every word that appeared in the analytes. I don't think any of you, if you don't know Chinese, you're not required to do that. So he spent a lot of time. And yet, he's not able to study Mencius or any other text, because any word that doesn't appear in the analytes, he doesn't know. So, but he spent a lot of time. And yet, I think he made a wrong turn. I'll explain to you why, toward the end. But when he first encountered the analects, he said it's a bunch of archaic irrelevances. There's something in the past. Very few are relevant to our world today. And this reminds me, a scholar has coined a very interesting term, historically significant. And whether you put emphasis on the first word, historical, or the second word, significant. One sense of historical significance is meaning it's only historically significant. It's not relevant to us today. So it's like studying a historical text. If you mastered it, you know a moment in Chinese history, maybe 6th century BC, when the master philosophized, moralized about the world and for his students. The other word is historically significant. I mean, the significance is long during, sort of transtemporal, which means it's extremely relevant to our world today. Now, Simon Leys is a very well-trained sinologist, translated this book with the idea that it's for college students, for you. And he believes it is both inspiring and important or significant. So you can, I don't think in this class you can make a choice. In other words, you have to take it seriously as a source of inspiration. Even if you felt you couldn't get into it, and force yourself to try to see whether you can get into it. And I think if you try, you'll get into it. And as one of the great classics, it has influenced millions of people. It's considered one of the most influential books in human history. In fact, I was invited to the Library of Congress a number of years ago to address the analects. And 8 books were selected by a committee of the Library of Congress that should be required texts for every educated American. And of course, Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Ethics, and also the Federalist Papers and so forth. The analects was the only one who's outside of Western classics. So that's serious. And this very interesting statement. If you read a text, of this magnitude, and nothing happens, don't blame the text. Okay. So how do we see the text? As I see it, that's my personal view. So I think it's discussable and publicly accountable. The text doesn't have a linear structure. So if you begin to read the text and try to find from the first statement about learning until the end, and try to find a kind of logical progression, you fail, because that's not intended to be that. It is not an argument, consistent argument or sustained argument about something. It's not an essay. No, you're asked to write an essay. If you do the essay as you see the analects, the essay would be considered maybe C-, because there's no coherence, there's no argument, there's simply a bunch of aphorisms. And since you're not as great as Confucius, your aphorisms may not to be very persuasive. But anyway, what is it? My assumption is it's centered around a great personality. That personality is called Confucius. And it is a historical figure, not a fictional figure. And assuming that some of the people like us want to understand this personality. And to understand a personality is to understand a person. The difference between understand a person and understand all the topics you study, sociology, anthropology, psychology, neurophysiology, and so forth. You study basically static structure. You can do experiment, you can study again and again, the thing doesn't change, right? The structure is basically stable and static. If you study a person, one thing you have to know is the person changes. Now, if the person changes, you cannot develop a structure that is static and try to capture the person. That's the wrong move. You have to respect the changing structure, the changing process, I think it's better to call it process of the person, in order to adjust your lenses and in order to capture it. Another thing is, can you study a person and you